So good evening, everyone, or good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to our webinar on governance and management of autonomous organizations. My name is Bo Tang, and I am the host today. I'm from Hong Kong UST. It's my great pleasure to kick off this insightful session that promises to be both engaging and informative. So we are gathered here to explore the fascinating world of autonomous organizations and the complex dynamics of their governance. So today's presentation will delve into the nuances and of power distribution, efficiency, and the inherent challenges that come with the pursuit of autonomy in organizational structures. So let me introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Daniel Ferreira from the London School of Economics. So Professor Ferreira is a renowned scholar in the field of corporate governance and organizational economics. His extensive research has significantly contributed to our understanding of the interplay between finance, management, and organizations. Professor Ferreira has authored numerous influential papers and articles that have shaped academic and policy debates worldwide. His work spans a variety of topics, including corporate boards, ownership and control structures, organizational design, knowledge and hierarchies, innovation and risk-taking incentives, corporate strategy, personnel economics, group decision-making, markets with adverse selection, and bank governance, amongst others. And he's currently working on topics such as blockchain governance, discrimination in the workplace, and the design of jobs and career structures. And today he will be presenting his latest research, co-authored with Professor Jing Li from Hong Kong U Business School, which addresses the governance dilemmas faced by autonomous organizations. So their paper provides a compelling model that illustrates the trade-off between autonomy, decentralization, and efficiency, and we are eager to learn more about their findings. So Daniel, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks for an invitation and for the nice introduction. I have to say that one of my biggest accomplishments was to serve as your PhD supervisor, which is something you didn't mention, but I'm very, very proud of that and how much you have achieved.
Thank you. I should have mentioned it. Sorry, I forgot.
So okay, so this is some theory work that I've done with my very good friend Jing Li from the University of Hong Kong. Let me give you some of the motivation for what we are doing. So I want to start with this quote from a paper by Steve Cheung that's illustrating the team production problem with a very peculiar example. And this is a quote that my co-author Jing Li likes very much, and that's why we have it in the paper, and you see also why we get some inspiration from it. So here he says, my own favorite example is riverboat pulling in China before the communist regime, when a large group of workers marched along the shore towing a good-sized wooden boat. And the unique interest of this example is that the collaborators actually agreed to the hiring of a monitor to whip them. Okay, so what's the story here? You have people pulling a boat, up from the river. And so this is the essence of a team production problem, that you have many people that are collaborating to actually get something done together. The problem of this team production is what we all know is the possibility of free riding, that some people are just not going to put as much effort as others. So what is the solution to this problem? Well, let's hire someone else, some third party, some monitor that is just going to whip us if we don't work very hard. And we all agree that that's the right thing to do, because we don't want to be free riding and we don't want other people to free ride when we work together. So that's the essence of the problem and the essence of the solution. One issue with this solution is that hiring a third-party monitor is not always feasible or desirable. For example, it could be that the monitor that you have to hire, the person with the whip, may charge a lot for this work, and maybe the team does not want to pay as much for them. Or it could be you cannot find a competent monitor out there. Or it could also be that the monitor is corrupt, that once you give the whip to somebody, this person is just going to abuse their power and just going to extract bribes from people in exchange for lighter whipping. So what we want to do in our paper is to consider a situation where you have a team production problem, just like the riverboat pooling, but we do not want to hire a third-party monitor, or we cannot do that, either because the third party is not honest, is incompetent, or is very expensive. So here our problem is the problem of incentivizing team members when hiring a third-party monitor is either infeasible or undesirable. And in a situation like that, we say we have an autonomous organization. Okay, so what is an autonomous organization? Well, if we ask the dictionary, that's what the dictionary is going to tell us. The dictionary says that autonomous is having the right or power of self-government. What does that mean? In our particular example, if we consider the riverboat pooling example, self-government means that the whip must be assigned either to a team member or to no one. Okay, so the key thing is that if the organization is autonomous, I cannot get someone from the outside to help me out. Everyone, so all contracts and all promises must be enforced internally. Just to put it in a different way, an autonomous organization, there is no outside enforcement of contracts. Okay, and that's exactly what we're going to be calling an autonomous organization in this paper. So what do? We present a game theoretical model of an autonomous organization. In this organization, because there is no external enforcement of contracts, there are only two types of contracts. You either have relational contracts or self-executing contracts. So what are these? So a relational contract is a contract that is enforced just based on trust and reputation. So if I promise to do something, because I'm going to be playing the same game with you for a long time, I might as well just do what I promise. Otherwise, you're going to find a way of punishing me in the future. So these are relational contracts. But we can also have self-executing contracts, which are contracts that don't require any kind of enforcement because the enforcement is automatic. The best example is to think about contracts that are just enforced by, say, computer code. So if you want to think about the best examples, and I'm going to mention them later, is to think about blockchain organizations, in which case you can program some rules. Some contracts can be self-enforced in this way because the computer code will make sure that this is that the contract is executed. So this is what we call self-executing contracts. The key point is that if an organization is autonomous, you can only have these two types of contracts. You can only have relational contracts or self-executing contracts. You cannot have contracts that are enforced externally. You cannot call the government or regulators to interfere into what you're doing. So in our model, we have an organization that produces a common good. You can think of this as a public good, with individual inputs, which we may think as of effort from its members. So it's just like the riverboat pooling example, like we have people just putting effort to perform a collective task. Now, of course, the economics literature has has studied problems like that. So there's actually a large literature on relational contracts. So the way that we add to that literature, so we start from a very simple canonical relational contract setup, and we modify it in two ways. The first one is that we allow the organization to designate one of the members as a manager. So we're going to have one member that is going to be different from the rest. And being a manager means what? Being a manager, as in the riverboat pulling example, the manager will hold the whip that she can use to discipline the subordinate. Of course, this is just a it's just a hypothetical whip. It's not a real whip that we have in mind. But what we want to say is that the manager can do something directly to punish a subordinate if the subordinate does not follow the right orders. And we just call it a whip, just for the analogy to the riverboat example. So that's the story. When you are a subordinate and you face an instruction from the manager is telling you what to do, there are two things you can do. You can either follow the order and everything is going to be fine, or if you don't follow the order, you're going to be punished, you're going to be whipped. But of course, you don't want to be whipped. So if you decide not to follow the order, it's better for you to leave the organization altogether. So leaving, exiting the organization is always an option, either for managers and subordinates. So the subordinates really have only two options when they face an order. They can either follow the order, or if they don't want to follow the order, they're just going to leave the organization, because by leaving the organization, they avoid being punished by the manager. So that's the story. And we want to think about the governance of these organizations. So how are we going to define governance in this setup? In our setup, we're going to have the organizational members. They will commit to a particular governance structure. And what is a governance structure? It's simply a set of rules that allocate the whip or allocate power to different members depending on what has happened in the game so far. So for us, governance is simply the decision of who gets to be a manager. Okay, so but we will allow governance we allow different governance structures, such as like giving the whip to just one player forever, or alternating. Sometimes I'm the manager, in the future you'll be the manager, and so on and so forth. And our question is, which of these structures is better? You can already see that one way of characterizing these governance structures is that we can think of them as being very centralized. What does that mean? Well, if I am the manager forever, it's a very centralized structure. But if we rotate, sometimes I'm the manager, sometimes you're the manager, and we keep on rotating like that, that's very decentralized, because everyone gets a chance to be the manager at least once. So the question is it better to have a centralized governance structure or decentralized governance structure? So that's going to be quite crucial for us. And our key result is actually that there is a conflict between three things: autonomy, decentralization, and efficiency. Meaning what? Well, meaning that if you really want to preserve your autonomy, you want to have an autonomous organization in the way that we have defined, you have to give up either the goal of decentralization or efficiency. To put it in a different way, in an optimal autonomous organization, and optimal here means efficient as it can be. In an optimal autonomous organization, the governance structure has to be centralized. So in equilibrium, managers will actually, because it's going to be very centralized, so I don't know why I have these red things here, so it might have been me, and I don't know how to take them out, but sorry about that. So because the governance structure is centralized, the managers or the manager who has all the power will abuse their power. And as a consequence of having this power, having the monopoly of the whip, they will enjoy higher payoffs. Okay, but at the same time, so that's, I guess maybe that's the bad thing, that you're going to you're going to leave more rents to a particular type of player. But at the same time, the managers are also going to be incentivized to exert effort to prevent the subordinates from exiting the organization. And this is what we call the paradox of power, meaning that by letting the strong party abuse his or her power, the weak party gains power over the strong party via exiting. I'm going to be more precise about what I mean about this a bit
Daniel,
later.
can I ask a clarified question?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
just now you mentioned about decentralization, like how you model decentralization. So do you mean that if it's fully centralized, that means the manager always be the same person?
Yes.
If it's decentralized governance, in your model, it's like it can be different people, but in turn, but just one manager. It's not like different people vote for a proposal or something, right? So
Yes, no. So it's not going to be different people voting simultaneously. That's not what we're going to mean by decentralization in this case. The problem with the word centralization is that there are many different ways to think about it. What we are focusing on is centralization of managerial power. What we are assuming essentially that if you're going to have a monitor, if you're going to have a manager, you cannot have more than one at the same time. Otherwise, there is no accountability, right? So we're just making that assumption that power is a scarce resource. So once you have someone who's going to tell people what to do, you can only have one person to do that. Otherwise, there is confusion. Okay, so you cannot have multiple people telling people what to do. So you're just going to have one person telling people what to do. Then at every single point in time, you do have a manager. So how can you have a manager but still be decentralized? Is that the manager can rotate, right? So it's not always the same manager. So if I abuse my power as a manager today, I know in the future I will no longer be a manager. So in that case, I probably will not abuse my power. But there are different ways of thinking about decentralizations. If we're thinking about people making decisions by voting, I'll mention this a little bit later on. That's a different form of decentralization. In our model, there is some natural decentralization from a technological point of view, because everyone is going to be putting effort in simultaneously. So there is technological decentralization in the sense that it's a team production problem.
okay, I see. So just one more question. So in your model, if like say full decentralization means that everyone has the same probability of being the manager, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And now let's let me just close this. Let's just think about maybe some applications now. So this is the introduction. Let me give you some applications. So I think the model is quite abstract in a sense that it can apply to, is not designed to model a particular organization that we actually see in the real world, but what would be the best examples of what we have in mind. So I think one example of an autonomous organization is what we call the decentralized autonomous organizations, or the DAO. So for those who don't know this, but a typical DAO is a blockchain-based entity, a blockchain-based organization that essentially raises funds from its members and then allocate these funds, normally called the treasury funds, towards a common goal. And members actually decide on the allocation of funds collectively, typically through voting, right? So in that sense, it is decentralized. However, that's again what I would call technological decentralization, that what you have to do is to collect information to decide what is the right decision, how to allocate these funds, and then go there and vote, right? So it's really a situation where, just like the riverboat pooling example, that many people simultaneously have to decide how much effort to put in the organization. In a DAO, I have to decide how much information I'm going to collect so I can vote the right way. And I would say that DAOs look like an autonomous organization because really they rely on a combination of self-executing contracts, because these organizations are usually written on top of Ethereum, which is a platform for smart contracts. So you have some smart contracts, some self-executing contracts, but you also have a lot of relational contracts because you have a lot of decisions or things that are done off-chain. But very rarely you're going to use externally enforced contracts. So this is really autonomous in the sense that we use here. And just a few facts about, I mean, the paper talks more about it, but just a few facts about DAOs that serve to motivate our paper. So first, DAOs are examples of direct democracy, right? So we say, let's allocate the funds and let's have everyone voting to decide how the funds are going to be allocated. This kind of direct democracy, not only in DAOs, but everywhere, is often very inefficient because it leads to very low participation rates. And this is a very well-established findings. You can look at the literature on this. You know, voting in DAOs is super low. It's often less than 1% turnout. And it makes a lot of sense because a lot of the things that people are voting in DAOs often can be some quite technical things, but it's also something that I can always free ride on my colleagues. So if I want to say, oh, how are we going to spend these funds? You know, I have to decide what are the right alternatives, but I'm just one among 1,000 people. So I'll just let other people decide. And then I won't bother about it. So it's exactly the free riding problem, right? So by designing the problem in this way, you don't really give incentives for people to do the right thing. And we see that most real-world DAOs have plenty of problems like that. They have also governance and management problems as well. And despite the fact that they are called decentralized, and of course they are decentralized in some ways, what I call the technological decentralization, that you have like all these people voting to make a decision. But in terms of governance, in practice, they are actually quite centralized because they usually have core teams, developing teams, and foundations which are very powerful. And if you want a good example, you know, because in the past people ask me, you only give bad examples, but your paper predicts that centralized organizations will perform well. So can you give an example of a centralized autonomous organization that performs well? And my example will be the Ethereum blockchain. The Ethereum blockchain is a relatively well-performing, high-performing organization in the sense that it is very successful in what it does. It's so successful these days that now there's a new ETF on ETH, which is the native token of Ethereum. So it's a relatively successful autonomous organization. However, it is very, very centralized in terms of governance. It's very, very tightly controlled by the Ethereum Foundation. There is no voting there, right? So there is no voting in Ethereum, right? So it's all essentially in practice decided by the Ethereum Foundation, which is a foundation that is controlled by one person, essentially. So Ethereum really has a king, and the king, you know, does somewhat as he pleases. Nevertheless, it is an autonomous organization according to our definition, and it is one that has performed relatively well. And that's what we would predict. If you really want to have an autonomous organization performing well, unfortunately, it will have to be centralized in terms of governance and not decentralized. So that's my story. Now, let me just get to the model. So we have the rest of the time to enjoy a little bit of game theory. So if you're not familiar with these kind of games, I'll try to be as intuitive as possible, but I do assume that you have some basic understanding of game theory, but it's a very fundamentally a very simple game. So we're gonna think about two players. It doesn't have to be two players. It can be, what we have in mind is really having maybe hundreds of players and things like that. But just to make it simple, let's think about two players, and the players will interact repeatedly. So this is gonna be an infinitely repeated game, and they're gonna share a discount factor delta. At each point in time, each player can choose a level of effort. And there are three levels of effort: 0, 1, and 2, meaning you can either shirk, no effort, you can work, which we call 1, or you can overwork, which we call 2. And the cost of effort is exactly equal to the effort. So if effort is 0, there's no cost. Effort is 1, the cost is 1. And sorry, it's not 1, the cost is C, and effort is 2, the cost is 2 times C. By putting effort in, you produce some output. So each worker will produce what output. So if I put no effort, there is no output. But if I work effort 1, I produce output big B. And if I overwork, I produce big B plus small b. Okay? And the idea is that small b is smaller than big B. And the total output would just be the sum of the two outputs, which will be equally shared. And this is going to be public information. The fact that we are sharing the output equally between the two workers it's convenient and it's important for the main part of the model, but we can also have an extension in which I can change this sharing of output. If I have time, I'll mention about it. But for now, I'm just going to take the output as the sharing of the output as given. Now, there are a few assumptions here. I'm just going to explain what they mean in economic terms rather than focusing on these particular parameters. So the first assumption essentially is saying that the optimal thing to do from an efficiency point of view is for both workers, both members, both players to work and put effort 1 every period forever, right? So the optimal thing to do is for us to say, let's both of us work. Let's not overwork or shirk, right? So working is the right thing to do. However, the parameters are also such that if I just play this game once, the only Nash equilibrium involves people shirking. So if the game is not repeated, no one is going to work, because the only way to induce people to work is the perspective of actually continuing this relationship, right? So if I'm just going to play it once, I'm just not going to work. So these are what these assumptions are saying. The second assumption is not an important assumption. It's just for convenience. And essentially is saying this: shirking is a bigger problem than overworking. Meaning what? It means that if of the two people, one of them work and the other overwork, this is better than both of them shirking. Okay, so it's more efficient for, say, for me to work and for you to overwork than for both of us not to work. If you're thinking, why would that be? It doesn't really matter. It's just reducing the number of cases we consider. So we don't really need this assumption. It just makes the presentation easier. So we're going to keep this assumption. And the third assumption is simply saying that the discount factor is not big enough, right? So the discount factor is not big enough so that even under repeated games, we're still not going to implement the first best, okay? So in this simple game, if we keep on repeating the game, we're not going to implement the first best. And what I mean by trigger strategies here is a simple strategy which says, look, if we don't do what we're supposed to do, next period, the game is going to end. That's what a trigger strategy is. So the reason why I keep on doing what I'm supposed to do is because I don't want the game to end, right? And what this assumption here is saying is that my discount factor, how much I value the future, is not high enough, which means that I would actually never do what I'm supposed to do. I'm never going to work just because I want to keep the game going, because I don't really care so much about the future. So this is a standard assumption just to make the story interesting. So these are the assumptions here. Now, what do we add to this problem? So far, this is a standard relational contract model that you find elsewhere in the literature as well. What is new here, as I mentioned before, is that one of the players now may be designated as a manager or as the manager. So that player, that manager, we're going to call that manager a she. So she will have the whip. So once a manager has the whip, she can recommend an action to the other player, which we call the subordinate here. The action could be either shirk work or overwork, one of the three. Now, after this recommendation is made, people can leave the game if they want. And if they leave, the game ends. The subordinate and the manager may decide whether to leave or not. But if they stay, then they have to exert effort. And in particular, what would be the payoff of the subordinate? Well, the subordinate will put some effort in. The manager will put some effort in. The sum of the two efforts will lead to the output, right? And you're going to share. Actually, this is just bad notation. I should replace this E with Y, but anyway, it's just the output, right? So you're going to share the two. You're going to share the output. You're going to get 50% of the total output. You're going to pay the cost of your effort. You know, if you put effort 1 or 2, you're going to pay the cost of that. And this final term here is the consequence of the whip. So what is this final term? Here we're saying this is just an indicator function which says if the effort you put in is lower than the recommended effort by the manager, you're going to be whipped. And if you're whipped, you're going to lose some value that we call D, which is very high. And high means greater than big B. Okay? So no one wants to be whipped, but you can avoid being whipped by doing what the manager tells you to do, in which case this term here becomes 0. Okay? So that's how we introduce the whip to the story. Now, this is just a timeline within every period. So the game is going to be repeated forever. And within each period, there's going to be a timeline. At the beginning of the period, there's some public signal that is random that is going to show up there. This is really just a trick that people use in this in models like this, in repeated game models like this, that just allows us to coordinate on some public signal, right? This is not really very important for anything, but it's just a way of saying I can have some strategies that we coordinate based on a common signal. So after the realization of the signal, then we're going to decide in some way who is going to get the whip, and then the manager, which is the person who gets the whip, will ask for some effort. Okay, so the assignment of the whip is gonna, is denoted by G, and the G is G indicates who has the whip. If G equals 1, it means that the first player has a whip. If G equals 2, is the second player has a whip. After that, the players decide whether to participate or not, whether to stay or leave. Then they decide whether to put effort in. And then the output is going to realize. And if there is any punishment to be made, if there is any whipping to happen, it's going to happen at the end of the period. Okay. So now this is just a piece of notation that doesn't really look very nice, but it's actually not really very important. This is just to say, first, we have a history, and a history is simply a list of things that have happened in the past, just like any history, right? So we have a history, all the things that have happened in the past. And what is important for us is our definition of a governance structure, which we call G. A governance structure is just a series of functions from the history plus that public signal to the allocation of the whip. So essentially, this is saying if the history of the game is this one, and then we have a particular public signal, I'm going to allocate the whip either to the first player or the second player. Okay. And finally, each player is going to have a strategy, and the strategy for each player will be a mapping or be a function from the history and the public signal to the decisions, to the actions that the players make in each period, which are 3. If I am the manager, I'm gonna make an order. I'm gonna say, this is what the subordinate has to do. Then I decide whether to participate or not, whether to stay in the firm or to leave the organization, and then how much effort I'm going to make. So these are the 3 things. These are the 3 things that each person has to do, both managers and subordinates. But of course, only the manager can actually issue an order. Finally, what is our definition of an organization? So organization can be defined by 3 things, what we call a primitive game, a governance structure, and an equilibrium profile of strategies. To make it simpler, without the whip, if there is no whip, what we have is just a game. And a game is nothing but a set of players, payoffs, a payoff structure, and a space of actions. And what happens is that we have this initial or primitive game, which is under the default governance structure. The default governance structure is a governance structure that no one has the whip. So that's what we call the primitive game. Then we have a governance structure, G, that modifies the rules of the primitive game by assigning the whip to some people according to some rules. And S is just an equilibrium of that modified game, right? So organization is essentially a game and its equilibrium, right? And a particular equilibrium of that game. That's what we call an organization here. Now, moving on to think about the model, how to solve it, this is just to say, as I mentioned before, we assume that parameters are such that the first best cannot be implemented in trigger strategies. Meaning what? Meaning that, well, if both players were to work forever without deviating, the present value of their payoffs will be this one here on the left-hand side. So this is the output if everyone works. This is the cost if I work in every period. And I discount this back to today, including today. That's the present value of working forever. If I decide not to work in a period, but then deviate and free ride and then end the relationship, I will not pay the C. I will get just the B, which is the output. I'll get only half of it because the other half goes to the other person. And as long as the left-hand side is greater than the right-hand side, we can have an equilibrium that implements the first best. But essentially, our assumption here, if you look down here, that the discount factor is low, implies that this condition never really holds. Okay, so we cannot achieve the first best under the standard governance, the default governance structure, which is saying that there is no WIPs to be allocated, right? So that's what makes the problem interesting, that we have to consider the WIP allocation to do a little bit better than just everyone not working. So what happens is that without modifying the default governance structure, the only equilibrium really is that nobody works. Okay, it's a very inefficient one. Okay, now what do we want to do? What we want to do is to consider the situation of a planner who will choose a particular organization. An organization here is just going to be a governance structure and in a particular equilibrium that will maximize. I mean, this looks ugly again, but this is just saying I'm maximizing the sum of the payoffs. So the efficient organization is the one that is maximizing the surplus for both players at the same time. Now, the problem, let me just go back here. This problem can be very complicated, you know, so this is like the way that we set up, this can be a very, very complex problem. So in order to tackle this problem, we use a trick. And the first trick is, let's assume that the organization is stationary. That simplifies the problem. And later on, we will consider the case in which the organization is not stationary, but most of the intuition can be grasped by thinking about the stationary organizations. And this will simplify the problem significantly. So what does it mean for an organization to be stationary? Oh, it means two things. It means first, that the governance structure is such that it is independent of history, right? And its IID is independently and identically distributed in the following way, that with some probability, which we call P, player one will have the WIP, and with probability 1 minus P, player 2 will have the WIP. That's essentially what is happening. So it's stationary, that at each point in time, with some probability, I get the WIP, with some probability, you get the WIP. Now, it's easy to define centralization in this context, because if we want to think a fully decentralized organization, then the probability P here must be 1/2, right? So if every time I have 50% chance of being the manager and you have 50% chance of being the manager, that's completely decentralized, right? But if I have 100% probability of being the manager all the time, then it's completely centralized. So the centralization index of an organization that is stationary is given by this. It's 2 times P minus 1. You can see that the centralization is 0 when P equals 1/2, and centralization is 1 when P equals 1 or 0, right? It doesn't really matter who has the power, because it's going to be equally centralized. For simplicity, I would just think of this fully centralized case as the case in which P equals to 1, okay? So now we have our first result, and essentially the most important. And so the first result is to say that in a stationary organization like this one, the player with the lower payoff will always shirk when this player is the manager. And it's very simple to prove, but let's not go through the proof. Let's just think about the intuition of what this means. The key idea here is that, say, if one of the players has a lower payoff, you know, if you are in some asymmetric equilibrium, which one of the players is a lower payoff, when this player gets to be the manager, first, this player does not want to work, is not afraid of being whipped because the player already has the whip, so he cannot be whipped by someone else. But that player can only be motivated to work by the perspective of continuing the relationship, by the continuation value of the organization. But if I have the lower payoff, it's simply there's not enough continuation value for me to be incentivized to work. Consequently, this player in equilibrium will never exert effort when they hold the whip. This is important because it implies what we call a shirking lower bound. It's a minimum amount of shirking that may happen in equilibrium. And this will be given by 1 minus the centralization index over 2. So now you can see that unless centralization is equal to 1, there's always going to be some shirking. So if the goal is to make sure that no one shirks in equilibrium, the only way that we can do that is, as you can see here, is by having centralization being equal to 1, in which case the shirking lower bound is 0, right? So this is really what explains why centralization is good for efficiency. So there are some other interesting results here as well. So we define 2 different types of organizations. Let's think about power blind organizations. So these are organizations where the power allocation does not affect effort. And identity blind organizations, this is an organization where the identity of the players does not affect effort. What we have here in this proposition is that in any organization that is either power blind or identity blind, the only equilibrium is that everyone shirks, right? So the intuition here is that every time we have symmetry, nobody works. So what we have here is that at least one player must change behavior when the whip changes hands. And when they do so, the changes cannot be symmetric. Or to be more precise, one player must always work harder than another, right? So in order to get efficiency, we need asymmetry. So that's why I'm calling it the curse of symmetry. We need one player to work harder than the other, right? So this is not going to be an egalitarian organization in any way, right? And then here we have what we call the paradox of power, which is this proposition just telling us what we can actually implement in equilibrium. So don't focus on the details here, but let me tell you what this number 1 and number 2 things are. Number 1 here says that we can implement an equilibrium in which, with some probability, the whip is going to be allocated to player 1. That's what this 1 here indicates, in which case player 1 is going to work and player 2 is going to overwork. But when player 2 gets the whip, because the whip is alternating, nobody works. So that equilibrium doesn't seem perfect, but it's better than 0, 0. It's 1, 2, 0, 0. So it's better than just 0, 0 all the time. This will happen if the organization is sufficiently centralized, if the probability that player 1 has a whip is sufficiently high. But if I keep on increasing this probability, I can do even better. I can do 1, 2 when player 1 has the whip, but I can also have, when player 2 has the whip, I can also have player 1 working rather than 0, right? So this is even better than the first case, but it requires an even higher degree of centralization. So the intuition here is that more centralization clearly will make the weak party, the party that gets to be manager less often, is going to make them work harder because that party fears the whip, fears being punished. But more centralization also incentivizes the powerful party, who will then work harder. And the way that this incentivization works is that the powerful party gets the chance to abuse her power and ask the weak party to overwork. You see, this overworking must always exist. And that increases the continuation value for the powerful party. And that's what makes the powerful party works harder. And that's what we call the paradox of power, that by giving more power to me, I essentially make the other party also powerful, because that party can exit and terminate my continuation value, and that forces me to work harder. You can see that moving from 1 to 2, the powerful party becomes more powerful, but it is worse off because it is working harder, and that's the paradox of power. Now, it is clear, let's just go back here. It is clear, it is clear that the best degree of centralization is when P equals to 1. Because when P equals to 1, I will always implement 1, 2, and I will not get the other case. But what this proposition here shows is that you can do even better in this case, right? So if you have organization where P equals to 1, a fully centralized organization, I can do a little bit better. I can have an action profile that randomizes between 1 and 2, that means work and overwork, with some probability, and with some probability they can have 1 and 1. What I cannot have is 1, 1, which is work, work all the time. I always need a little bit of abuse of power. And the intuition, again, is that unless there is some abuse of power, meaning that the manager, which is now always the same person, unless the manager has a higher continuation value because of this abuse of power, no one is going to work, right? So we really need the manager to be incentivized to work through the possibility of abusing the power in the future. Okay, so this is what we have. And then finally, our main result, which is what we call the organizational trilemma. Long story short, let me just read number 1 to you. It's just saying, if we want autonomy and decentralization, as we said, the only thing you can implement is 0, 0, right? So autonomy and decentralization is always fully inefficient. However, if we want autonomy and efficiency, the most efficient outcome, we need to have full centralization, right? And the number 3 is one thing I didn't say, but if we don't care about autonomy, then we can have decentralization efficiency as long as the monitor that we hire from the outside is sufficiently cheap. And this is what this is saying. But if we want to insist on autonomy, it's either inefficiency or centralization. There are a few more things we show. I'm going to skip just this figure here and say, if we allow for non-stationary organizations, and that's how we complicate the model, it turns out that the answer is very similar with one twist. So first, we will conclude that, yes, we want the manager we want to have a fully centralized organization forever. So we're always going to have the same player being the manager. But now, rather than every period, having a chance of working or overworking for the subordinate, now what they can do is that at the beginning of the relationship, everyone is going to work. There's going to be no overworking until some random period, big T, where the manager starts abusing their power. So it's a very interesting dynamic that it looks like a benevolent dictator. Even though the manager has all the power, in the beginning of the relationship, it looks as if the manager has no power, because the manager is behaving exactly in the same way as a subordinate. Until in the future, the manager starts abusing their power. So the abuse of power is always more efficient if it is backloaded, if it is back there in the organization, so in the future. And I think this is a bit of a cautionary tale for examples, if we think about Ethereum, for example, the Ethereum founder, Vitalik Buterin, is often referred to as the benevolent dictator, right? So he has a lot of power, but he doesn't seem to abuse his power. This might well be the case. All I'm saying is that the model predicts that at the beginning of an organization, the benevolent dictator is not going to abuse their power, but later they will, and that's, because that's the most efficient way of rearranging abuse of power. A final thing here, which I don't want to talk about really, is just that we can get rid of this inefficiency, this abuse of power, if we could redesign the sharing of the output. Rather than splitting 50-50, we could find different proportions. In that case, the inefficiency of abuse of power is going to go, but the governance structure will remain fully centralized. And on top of that, the manager will get a larger share of the output. So here's an example, again, that we need things to be asymmetric. The manager who holds the whip is also the one who's going to get the larger share of the pie. So this is an organization where centralization means not only power, but also payoffs, or also income is going to be higher for those who have power. So let me finish here, just a few takeaways. There's a lot of, I understand that it's an abstract paper that can apply to many different situations. So I'm just going to be a bit broad in my takeaways. One thing we see in this paper is that in the absence of external enforcement, in case of autonomous organizations, self-executing contracts can be used to support the relational incentives. In our model, this happened because the way that we implemented a governance structure is through a self-executing contract. And the availability of these contracts will improve the performance of these autonomous organizations, but that comes at a cost, right? Because to realize such gains, an autonomous organization must use these contracts, these self-executing contracts, as a tool for centralizing the power in the hands of a few people or just one person. So thank you very much. I think I'll stop here. My time is up, so I'll also stop sharing just in case.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. Very interesting and insightful paper. Yeah, it's very interesting. And maybe let me open the question to the floor. Any for the audience, any question about this Daniel's presentation?
Hi.
Yeah.
Okay, please go ahead.
Go ahead. I can be next.
Okay. Hi, Professor Ferreira. I think it's a very interesting paper, and you mentioned in the model that the history you see plays role in the governance strategy. And would you elaborate a little bit more on how this history can influence the dynamic governance structure? Does history play some role in the optimal governance strategy?
Yes. So first, I mean, we wanted to we wanted to allow the governance to depend on history, just to be more general, to allow for very complicated governance structures. But really, when I was talking about the stationary organizations, then history actually did not matter at all, because we could implement this governance structure without any reference to past history. And even when we allowed for organizations to be non-stationary, history actually never really matter, right? But we just want to make sure that we're not assuming that that was not an imposition, that was a conclusion. But now, if you want to think about this in reality, in application, I think in general, it is possible to design governance structures that are based on history, meaning that, well, we want to allocate the power to one particular person, to a manager, depending on what has happened in the past. And I think in the case, for example, of blockchain organizations, that's actually fairly easy to do in practice, because you do have the history of all the actions that have happened on chain. So in principle, you could design a system that allocates, power to different players depending on what has happened in the past. So your question is well taken. It turns out that in the model, history doesn't really play an important role, because we could find the best organization that didn't really depend on what has happened in the past. So our organization depends only on this randomization device that we said before, and so there is no very important role that history play. But we didn't want to make that assumption. We want to allow for the organization to depend on history, and then show that history plays a very limited role.
Yeah, that's a very interesting conclusion. You see, finally, the history doesn't matter in the best design of this governance structure. It's very interesting, I think.
Hi. Hello.
Hello, iPhone 2.
Yes, this is Long Chen from Luohan Academy. Thanks for presenting the interesting paper. And so I think there's a couple of ways to put a cap or limit on DAO. And I still remember about 4 or 5 years ago, I had a lengthy discussion with Ben Holmstrom. We were at the airport for like 3 hours. We was trapped there with discussing the future of the blockchain, decentralized stuff. And I think that part, I think we were talking about there's a lot of the uncertainty that cannot be put into a smart contract. So that to deal with it's impossible actually to put everything into the contract. That's why we think for sophisticated organizational or coordinations and smart contract, this kind of the decentralized stuff doesn't work. And I think you're putting a different perspective to put a cap on this. I believe we're talking about if you think about different parties, incentive stuff, the positioning stuff, then that is another angle. To put together, I have a couple of suggestions. One is that I think you could be, I know economists tends to be conservative, but I think we need to put a cap to stop people from putting stupid money into this, and to say, where's the limit of this deal? Because I actually I talk to a lot of the entrepreneurs, and they somehow these people invested in the blockchain. They think this kind of the world will become decentralized, and so I think we need to be more specific on this. So what's the limit of this? But the further I would think one is to put a limit on how far it can go. The second is to explore what are the scenarios, use cases, coordinations that are most fit for this DAO. So what are the most important features of this? And to have a conjecture on the future. What's the typical form of the organizations, DAO versus the centralized AO, right? So it's the centralized organization. So what's the best combinations to put a good judgment, assessment on how it will evolve. And I think that will be very helpful. So it's not just about, well, there's a limit on how far the DAO can go, but also about that actually it has its particular strengths, its particular fit which kind of use case. And so in the future, it's going to be some combination of them, and how does it look like? And what's the implication for this? So I think that if you look forward to further work on this, and that will help the people to guide, to think about what we should expect. And so anyway, that's my recommendation.
So thank you, Long. I mean, I could not agree more to essentially everything you said. So starting from the first point that you mentioned in your conversation with Ben Holmstrom, it is actually one limitation of smart contracts is that you're not going to make them complete contracts in any way, because it's impossible to put everything in, right? So that's one thing that, of course, we economists, we do not model it explicitly. We sort of assume it sometimes, right? That, some things, it's just contracts are going to be incomplete. And even in our paper is a little bit of that. We assume that you can contract on the allocation of the WIP, but not other things, right? So implicitly, we're doing what you're saying, but we don't really have a formal justification for that. But as you said, what we are doing in our paper is showing all the limitations that comes from the incentive structure as well, right? On top of so you cannot have complete contracts, but also there are limitations to what you can achieve through smart contracts, because since smart contracts cannot be complete, then other sets of incentives are going to enter, and then we get some kind of trilemma or dilemma where you cannot get one thing or the other. In our case, you cannot get full decentralization and full efficiency at the same time. So this links to your point that there are limits to what these organizations can do, right? And the idea that this is the future of everything, I could not agree more. That's just nonsense to me, right? I can see a situation there is, there might be some space for decentralized organizations like these, like blockchain-based organizations in general in the future. The idea that this is going to be a panacea that, is going to solve all the problems we face with contracts and with networks. I think it makes no sense. That this is not just a technological problem, right? So these are incentive problems and governance problems that have existed for thousands of years. It's not going to be solved. It's not a technological problem. So technology can help in some ways. Some kind of contracts can be automated, but it's quite limited what you can actually do with smart contracts.
Yeah, I think we can be more straightforward on this. As you open up the paper, we're talking about the RONA codes, talk about it's like RONA codes talk about this, some limit transaction cost perspective on how far organizations can go. There's also a message talk about how far can a DAO can go. And then the follow-up step is to say what this limit, but what is most useful for what use cases, and how the future of organizations look like. I think you can probably write a sequence of insightful either academic articles or just applied articles talk about it. And so because I think there's not enough insight on this, and the people are in the Web3 literature are essentially, they don't have a good framework to think about those things.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your comments. I completely agree, and hopefully this is what we will continue to do or try to do more. There's not much being done from a conceptual perspective. Yeah,
exactly. So I think you can have put a mark on this to help the literature and practitioners. They had the setback. I think in the past several years, we've seen the setback in the blockchain literature, the practice, and not much going on besides the Bitcoin. So what's the nature of that? What's the limit of that? What other use cases it can be applied for? There's a lot of the, I think, anxiety and for the practitioners, and so they need the logic. So I think it's time actually. I think you can make it clearer for the. It's not just for the academic entertainment, but actually for the practitioners. I think you can have a sequence of the message on this. That should be great.
Thank you very much. I completely agree.
Oh, yeah, I also have I have two questions, Daniel. So the first question is actually related to Long's question and comments. So actually, I think it's very insightful, because previously when I was thinking about blockchain governance or like DAOs, I only realized I only think about the dimension of centralization versus decentralization, and it's very insightful that you point out another dimension, autonomous, so autonomy. So I think no one has really think carefully about autonomous means. So I was and you also mentioned about like a centralized autonomous organization might be maybe most efficient ones. And I was thinking about my question is actually, so compared to a centralized company, what is the advantage of the centralized autonomous organization? So do we really need it? So so what do you think? Actually, it's an open question. What's the future of it? Because I think you mentioned it when like the third party is not I mean, it's not honest, not competitive, not it's expensive. So we typically need like autonomous organization might be maybe better than the centralized company. So does it mean that I was thinking that maybe in less developed countries where the third party is not trustworthy, the autonomous organization may be like more useful? I don't know. I mean, yeah.
Well, I guess that's the idea. So first of all, I related to your point, no one is paying much attention to the autonomy part, and also people conflate autonomy with automation, which are different things, right? When people say, well, you know, they forget that the autonomous part of an organization is not whether you have some contracts that can be executed automatically, right? So automation or automatically is not the same as autonomy. Autonomy means that everything is done internally without resorting to external enforcement. And the question is then is a natural question. So when do we want to do that? In a typical corporation, a corporation is not autonomous. The corporation is going to be regulated, is going to be affected by the law of is incorporated as a legal system. So we accept the legal system. There are courts and things like that. As you mentioned, in situations where we don't want to be bound by the legal system, right? We don't want to deal with regulators because we don't trust them. Then we can have an autonomous organization. The whole idea of Bitcoin was based on that, wasn't it? It was the idea that this is not going to be under the control of anyone. That's going to be fully autonomous more than anything, right? So if there are reasons for us to want autonomy, because we don't trust the courts, we don't trust the regulators, right? We don't trust the government. That's how we do it. But then the problem, that's the paradox. If we go think about Ethereum, you know, so Ethereum, it's not a legal person. So you cannot sue Ethereum. If something goes wrong for you when operating at Ethereum, you cannot sue the CEO of Ethereum because there is no CEO of Ethereum, right? So you cannot use this to recover your money, which might be good because you may not trust the courts. On the other hand, now you have to trust the people who run Ethereum. So you're just replacing the trust because Ethereum is going to be centralized. So you're just replacing the trust of the government. You don't trust the government, fine. But now you have to trust the people, the foundation that runs a particular organization. And why would you trust them more than the government? That's a question, right? So I don't have the answer, but I think in practice, most people assume that they say you don't have to trust anyone. That's nonsense. You have to trust somebody because these organizations are centralized. I don't want to talk about Bitcoin, but if you talk about Ethereum, I think there's no question that Ethereum is very centralized from a governance perspective. If you want to change the reason why Ethereum moved to proof of stake, for example, was because they're so centralized that they could coordinate. Right. So, but then you say, well, but it's fine. That was the right thing to do. Yes, you trust the leadership. If you trust the leadership, then you're fine. But why would you? Why would you distrust the government but trust the Ethereum Foundation? It's not clear to me. But if that's the case, then fine. So yeah, you're just replacing the trust that you have. You have to trust somebody. It's not trustless.
Thank you. And I totally agree. And also, my another question, actually, I think the value of value creation or like the innovation of blockchain brings to us, in addition to trust, another dimension is the incentives. So because the blockchain, they can issue some tokens which can changes the incentives of their members. So I was wondering how does like the incentives of because when we say like autonomous organization, like typically there are tokens, right? So do you think it is an important dimension we should consider in autonomous organization compared to centralized company? And also and related to your paper, I think for example in a centralized governance structure, I was wondering how can members who are not in management maintain high levels of motivation and participation established, especially when their power is relatively small, right? How can they still be motivated?
So trying to answer the two questions. So about tokens. So tokens might be valuable, but they have nothing to do with autonomy. Right? So you can design an organization with tokens and the organization doesn't have to be autonomous. Right? So I think these are separate things, right? So it's not, you can have an organization that has external enforcement of rules, that is regulated by governments and things like that, and it still has tokens. So I think these two things are not, they don't have to come together. So you may say one of the benefits of the blockchain organization, yes, it's the creation of tokens, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that they have to be autonomous, right? So I think that these are separate issues. Why do we need autonomy for having tokens? It's not clear to me, and I don't think you do. So that's the first one. And the second point was about
So it was about the how in a centralized governance structure, how can members who are not in management maintain high levels of motivation?
And actually, our paper provides an answer to that. Those who are not in manager, they're going to be disciplined by managers. That's the only incentive. So the only way to make sure that people are working the way they're supposed to do when they are not managers is because they are afraid of being punished by the managers. And that's the whip. So that's two things. It's a very asymmetric thing. The subordinates are motivated by the whip. They are afraid of what managers will do to them. And that's what we encounter in our organizations, right? Your boss is going to fire you and you don't want that to happen. That's what motivates you to a large extent. But what motivates the bosses? What motivates the bosses is the perspective that by continuing in employment, they're going to get a lot of surplus. Right? So it's really they're not going to be fired if you're really the boss. You're not going to be fired, but what you don't want is that your employees, your subordinates exit the organization and take the human capital that they have with them. So you don't want them all to leave, right? So just thinking about a company in general, but you can think about a blockchain organization as well. So that's the key thing. What we have in the model, that this arises naturally as equilibrium. If you want everyone to be a manager, no one's going to work. That's what we're saying.
送一下就出来了。
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I believe that Shumil has another
May,
question.
may I? Also, yeah, let's zoom in.
No,
You
no.
talk.
Yeah.
Okay, so Daniel, this is Shumiao from Oxford. So very exciting presentation, and it's very insightful. So the trilemma makes sense, and I'm thinking about what would be the solution for this trilemma. And it seems that the first thing that pop up from my mind is AI. So it seems that it can be a natural external mechanism that people can interact with, and potentially be the digital whip that can give different people the right incentives to make the organization really functional. So just wondering what would be your thoughts about in the future, the combination of DAO and the AI?
Well, so I think it's a good question. I think AI will probably allow the self-executing contracts to be more sophisticated, right? So AI will allow for more things to be automated, right? The execution of more things to be automated. I think ultimately it's not going to solve the essence of the problem, which is not even with AI we will be able to put everything in a contract, because natural intelligence is not able to create complete contracts, to think about all the possible contingencies, and artificial intelligence is going to suffer from the same problem, that artificial intelligence will not be able to think about all possible scenarios that are going to happen in the future, especially if AI continues to be what it is now, that is, it is essentially being trained on data that is created by actual human beings, right? So AI will be able to automate more things, for sure. There's no question about that. But for the things that cannot be automated, I think the problem will remain. So the question is, if the question is, so can we have a decentralized autonomous organization that is more efficient because it uses AI? And I'll say, sure, that's probably the case. We will be in a situation where we don't need centralization anymore. Then I think it's not the case. I think the fundamental force driving centralization of decision-making and governance, I think, is a very strong one, that the only way to get away from this is either to forget about autonomy, right? So if you forget about autonomy, if you're going to use the courts, then you can be decentralized, right? But then people don't want to use the courts. They don't want to have regulators. They don't want to have anyone messing with a blockchain organization. And then you have to centralize that power somewhere. So you always need someone to have this whip, right? Because there's always going to be things that cannot be in the code. So we need someone who's going to have the whip. And the question is, who has a whip? Is it the government, or is some person inside the organization? I think that's the only point we're trying to make. So AI will make some of the self-executing contracts more efficient, I believe, right? But it's not going to solve the essence of the problem, that we need some centralization of who holds this whip, who can penalize people who misbehave in a way that the code didn't predict. That's the key thing.
Anybody else?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So my question is, when I'm listening to your speech, and when I put myself into the different situations you mentioned, I'm thinking maybe these partners or the subordinates are not rational enough to analyze and always make the most rational decision for themselves. Like, for example, taking their emotional reactions to the whims from the managers as consideration. So my question is, would we taken the psychological or behavioral aspects into the consideration maybe in the future for your research?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good point. I mean, the problem is that there are too many ways for people to be irrational and emotional, and just one way for them to be cold-hearted and rational. And of course, we are analyzing a model where everyone is fully rational in a way that is completely unrealistic. What I think is that once you add the potential for behavioral biases and irrationality and emotions to play a role in this case, what we'll get is that the problems are not going to get easier; they're going to be harder, right? So, and what I think the way to interpret what we're doing is to think about, well, maybe the people participating in this organization, they don't really know what they're doing; they're not super rational. But if they have a governance structure of this sort, they will probably survive because that's the most efficient one. So it's more of an evolutionary kind of argument, right? So if I have a centralized organization just by accident, such as Ethereum is going to thrive. I think one of the reasons why Ethereum has dominated the competitors so far, in large extent, is because it's so centralized. Maybe people didn't think about it this way, but it so happened this way, and that's why they survive. And if you have other organizations that try to be more decentralized, because the founders emotionally thought that they wanted to be more decentralized, they haven't been as successful. So I think that's the way I think about it. I think, yes, emotions and biases play a big role in the real world and in design of these organizations as well. No question about it. But if you don't design these organizations in a way that is the most efficient one, they're not going to survive very long. So I think that the ones that have been more successful tend to be, if they are autonomous, they tend to be centralized, even if people haven't really thought about how to, haven't even thought about why they're doing it this way.
So one more question is that probably you have already taken a deep look at some kind of DAO organizations in the real world. Are there any examples that they are matching your theory and there are some differences that maybe reflect the emotional reactions to your theory?
Yes, so I think the most examples that we have investigated, what we see is, for example, that most of these organizations tend to be very clearly inefficient in the way that they incentivize their members to vote. Because the organizations, most of the decentralized autonomous organizations, they are there to, their main role is to get all members to vote to make a decision. And because the voting, the voting turnout is very low, that must be very inefficient because that's not what you want. And the reason why voting turnout is very low is because of free riding. And free riding is just an example that the incentives are not aligned. And I think it fits the theory in the sense that these organizations are trying to be as decentralized as possible, right? But as a consequence of that, they become very inefficient. And the counterexample in the blockchain space, as I mentioned before, a blockchain like Ethereum, there is no such vote. What you have is a bunch of developers collaborating with one another. And there are many of those developers, but it seems to work relatively well. But you have a boss, right? So what you have there is a boss. So I think these are the actual examples, the cases where you clearly have a boss that is actually, giving direction and coordinating people. You have some results. In other cases where expect everyone voluntarily just to gather their information, and there is no punishment if they don't do that, right? So this is a situation where there is no whip, there's no punishment when they do it, then it becomes very inefficient. So I think it does fit what we see out there. At least that's my reading.
Thank you. That's very insightful.
Thank you, Rina.
I guess Longs, do you have some question or comments?
Yeah, I think I'm repeating myself, but I'd
Please
like
do.
to talk a bit with Daniel. So basically, I think there are a couple of messages. So essentially, let's think about the nature of organizations. Starting from the Rona course, so talking about transaction costs, but then I think a message you are trying to deliver, but we're trying to see how valid it is to so basically your message is there is an end game of DAO. I think we could be more, it's not just a cautionary note. There should be an end game. It's almost like the Runa course put a restriction on how institutions, organizations can grow. And I think they can also make it very clear in whatever form, in your paper or write some articles, talk about this end game of DAO. But then the further up, I think perhaps you can write an article, think about how do we design DAO? So for DAO designers, because there will be a bunch of them based on the blockchain, this or that. So what are they most suitable for? And how should they design DAO combined with the centralized mechanisms? And from their perspective, give them some prescriptions and logic. I think that would be an interesting article and directly address to their need. Anyway, I think I'm repeating myself, but I think it's worthwhile to be clearer about your message and implications. That would make it more powerful.
Yes, well, I believe in repetition. Repetition is good. We want to make the point. I agree with you. It's in a way the current model of decentralized autonomous organizations. If we take that as a given, I think it's, as you mentioned, it's the end game. That doesn't really work, right? So it has to be something else. And then to your second point, what is the optimal design of such organization? What is the optimal way of designing decentralized autonomous organization? And I agree with you, that would be interesting to work on. I'll give you a reference, actually, if you're interested more in this. There is I met with a political scientist, a quantitative political scientist that is actually working on that, right? And there's not very many people doing this. It's his name is Andy Hall he's at Stanford GSB, and what he's doing, not only academically, but actually he's working with A16
practitioners on mechanism design.
Yes, and he's working with people in the crypto, in the venture capital,
Right.
venture capitalists working with crypto. So he's working on, for example, redesigning voting systems and constitutions for decentralized autonomous organizations, right? And one of his main criticisms is that direct democracy doesn't work, right? So you have to redesign the voting systems, and you also have to redesign their constitutions to try to solve some of the problems. He's taking a different route. I think, certainly thinking in terms of direct democracy is a mistake, because we learned from history that direct democracy leads to free riding. And that's what we're seeing in decentralized autonomous organizations now. I think the point that we need centralization in terms of governance, I think this is a bit less well understood, and I hope that we could do some more work on this as well. But if you're interested, check out this guy, because he's doing interesting stuff in that space, and he's a political scientist, so he's really thinking about issues such as the constitution of blockchain-based organizations, and also different ways of voting and organizing the democratic aspects of these organizations.
Right. I think it's the theme here is that what's the optimal organization, the mechanism and the logic in the digital age, right? So I think your paper and the guy you mentioned are contributing to this literature, and for the practitioners, the blockchain guys, the Web3 guys, they just lack the institutional perspective. So I think it's a very good help to them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? We have run over time for like 35 minutes. Sorry, Daniel.
Sorry,
I know you are
sorry about
busy.
that. I mean, well,
Yeah,
I want to keep you guys awake. It's evening there. Here's still the middle of the day.
There are still like more than 30 people online. Yeah, it's I believe that I believe that everyone finds it very insightful and interesting. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation and for sharing your expertise with us. And also thank you all for joining us today. So yeah, so I think we should let you go. And
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Daniel. Bye.